you very much, Dale. I have my own thanks pretty much to the same set of people. It's very, very unusual for an artist to do work so far away from my own culture and then do it twice in very different contexts, which is also to say that when I was first invited, which was by Hamad Nassar, who I met while working in Hong Kong, he saw a project called Cinema Island, which was there, and he simply wanted to ask me to do it again in this city for the, accompanying his exhibition. And I didn't feel that that's the right thing to do, to simply just transplant one occasion and one type of work into this context. So I asked if I could develop something new. And we wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't really for him and this initial invitation, and also trust that for someone who virtually had no contact with this part of the world could bring something of meaning, which was, his idea for the exhibition: structures of meaning, architectures of perception. So I'm very sad he's not here tonight to contribute, but he's in London doing other things. And then, of course, the whole team at DCT with Michelle, Diala, and Dana, and many others worked very, very hard for the first edition. And then to have it again is really incredible insight of Michelle proposing to, I think, Maya initially, and then Maya thinking how to accommodate this little alien structure into the university. And it's a huge honor for me to, in fact, make this edition in the site, which for 30 years I have also been teaching, and to be able to kind of rethink how it works in a setting where intellectual life happens, but also where we all produce knowledge collectively. So thank you, Dale, for taking that upon yourself to make it happen. And it's got now its little corner to live here for 3 weeks. So what I'm going to do is to trace back to the kind of origins of how a project like this, which really involves many themes and engages not just with film in this case, but also engages with ideas of publicness and public memory, and how that is staged. While we all have our own memories, the place where we struggle is how to represent them. And of course, it's not only artists that struggle with representation, it's all of us, whether it's to do with our national identity, ethnicity, memory always comes into it, but even more importantly, what comes into it is the question of representation. When so this project kind of tries to, I guess, both tell you something about yourself, tell you something about what it means to transgress from the public to the private, how to incorporate something that is invisible, and that's women and their voices, and how to address kind of wider issues of cultural representation in a place which is not, not easy to understand, especially for me. So I began working with these ideas in a project in Portugal, in 2012. I have to. So in 2012, Guimarães, which is a very small historic city in Portugal, was nominated this European City of Culture, and they commissioned a curator to invite artists to make sort of interventions in public space. And I was invited to do one of those. I have done other projects with cinema and the city, and this curator who invited me was aware of it. So I accepted this invitation, went to Guimarães. I've never ever heard about the city. I've never been to Portugal. So it was encountering a very new situation and a new history. And that's kind of, grid, or rather concentric center of Guimarães. And the way I work is that, I have no idea what to do to start with, but I usually spend most of my time, and I had about a year and a half to develop this project. So I would go and research for most of that time. And my way of kind of resolving that research will be in some form of a public outcome. But I never really decide whether it's a publication, an exhibition, a film, a talk. It really has to emerge from research. It's never something that I can decide before. And for me, it's a really important part of practicing. So I went to Guimarães a few times, and just to do like a reconnaissance of, what was there, the history. It was a small city which had a lot of manufacturing, which was obviously closed down because of the rise of manufacturing in China. So, I learned a lot about labor relations, but I had no idea what to do with it until I came across this man who was running a film club in Guimarães. And the film club was in existence, and it's still in existence, since 1958. And if you know anything about history of Portugal, Portugal until 1974 was pretty much a fascist country with a regime of Salazar. So the club was a site where it was not just to show films, but to actually use film as a site of resistance. And when I met this man, and he told me the story and he showed me around, they simply had, a room which was probably a quarter of the size of this room with few chairs, where they would do screenings for, 50 years. And what they did in those years, they would get films from distribution from Lisbon of pretty much, anything and everything. Mainstream films, sort of B-movies, experimental stuff. And they would discuss them, but they were very much discussing them in relation to their own political situation. And when they got the films from distribution, they would also get a trailer. And they would send back the film after screening, but they would keep the trailers. So what I encountered in the store was just a history. You could say it was like the history of film in trailers. And I thought that was a kind of a beautiful remnant of their activity. So I made the inventory of these trailers. Of course, they never did that. They just sort of put them and stored them. And once, once that was done, I decided to, in fact, build a cinema. That was my public sculpture, if you like, because to also honor their contribution, the contribution of the club to the culture. So rather than thinking of Guimarães as the sort of European city of culture that imports the culture, I thought, let's look at what these people have done for their city throughout the years. So it was, very much a kind of invisible activity which was brought to the center by commissioning a cinema structure, a little pavilion, where then I made a film out of those trailers. But I didn't want to make decisions as to which films to choose because, I didn't have, 10 hours to accommodate. I thought there would be an hour of trailers. So I went back to the factories and made screenings of the films in the factories and asked the factory workers to choose their favorite films. So there was also building a community that could then respond to the structure once it was there. And I invited an architect, Colin Fournier, to come up with a design for this public viewing cinema, which I gave him a brief that it needed to be open. At that time, the project was called Open Cinema. So he did this very wonderful intervention in the convention of cinema viewing, is that you, well, as you can see, get from underneath. So this is like another kind of alien beast. And once you're in, your head pokes in. And of course, there are other people. So it immediately connects you to the audience. And of course, people start, talking to each other and so on. So that was the first edition. The second edition, it was very successful because, everyone, oh, I need to be on camera. Everyone kind of took something out of it, whether it was the film or simply the experience of the public square, which was suddenly very, very different. There were kids, there were adults, there were people who used to go to the club. And I think people appreciated that it was something that related to their own community, and yet it was an international event, which got some recognition. So then we were invited to the following year, to the Lisbon Architecture Triennale, to get this beast in another public square, right by the river, which was much kind of larger, but also more abandoned. And that's how it looked there. And this is really what, this was our audience, simply people passing by. This was not something that was sort of designed for an art audience or any particular community. This was truly an open cinema. Now, for this edition, I didn't feel that showing the same film, which originated from the film club in Guimarães, would be appropriate. So then I went to the Cinemateca Portuguesa to look for materials to make a new film. And the new film was based on footage that I found there, which all related to different uses of public squares in Lisbon. And then most of these films were very early films, like from 1910s, 1920s. They were often silent, so I commissioned a soundtrack for the film. It's all on my website if you're interested. And that's inside the cinema there. And, the sort of my life went on, took me to Hong Kong. In 2014, I moved from London to Hong Kong. I was artist in residence at the Asia Art Archive and also started teaching at the Chinese University. And again, very different culture, very different set of questions. And one day, someone heard about the other editions of the cinema and invited me to develop a new edition for Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is a very different story to Portugal. The cinema that was built in Portugal, the cladding was cork, which is a local Portuguese material. That wouldn't make any sense, both climatically and also it's not a material used in Hong Kong. So we started sort of redesigning that structure, which was then, Hong Kong is all about shininess and luxury and prosperity and, pretty much like, I suppose, here has some of the same traits of aspiration through, being very, very visible in a certain way. So this is just a render of the, and that's how it looked. It actually had some similarity. It was indoors because climate there, very similar to here, humidity, impossible to just leave a structure outside. So we put it in, it was again part of an exhibition at a space called K11, which is basically a shopping mall with art in it. Some of you might be aware there's actually now several of them. There's one in Shanghai. But it was visible through the windows from what is a kind of a transit system outside. So people just walking to the underground could see this kind of strange structure. And similar, although we didn't have the pods, you also had to kind of duck in to get inside. As you can see, Hong Kong is a busy place, so we had plenty of people visiting and looking at it. And, there were children, so we made like a little stool that they could jump up and be elevated to see it. And this connection, which is a really important thing also in the edition here, it's this connection between you being visible to others, through your legs. Your presence is marked in a public sense. But you also enter this other world of film, which kind of dissolves the reality. So you're standing on the ground, but your head is floating into another space. And that connection between, the ground and, the film, which kind of transports you, is an important one. And you can see this in the picture here. Again, I made a new film. I made a film, it's called Everything. I felt Hong Kong was that kind of place where there was everything available. And I researched both archival footage and I also attempted something different, which was I based this film on a novel by Flaubert, Madame Bovary. And I exchanged, which in fact is spoken in Cantonese in the film. And I exchanged the kind of images of Paris with Hong Kong. And it was a perfect fit because that novel is all about luxury and aspiration and women kind of getting access to another world. So this is just an image from the film. Okay. And then the Cinema Island here. So I thought this was probably the hardest for me to, given the time, I didn't really have, a couple of years to research and meet people and understand what I can do within this culture. There's a lot of consistency in my work, which is around the question of cultural value, and also, you know, how it's produced, how it's disseminated, who owns it. These are the themes that I consistently been engaged with for pretty much the last 30 years. But I had no, you know, I never been to this part of the world. I didn't really know where to start. So when I came here first time in April of 2018 with Hamad, what was incredibly useful was to start meeting many, well, cultural producers, curators, people involved in projects here. One of them is here with us, and I'll tell them more about your role. And really through talking to people and listening and getting to know what is not, you know, I knew, let's say, the history or the official history, but I really didn't know what is the cultural life of UAE now. I also went to Dubai, I went to Sharjah. So what appeared from that was that all the cultural institutions and pretty much the culture was delivered by women. So everyone I met, you know, here in Dubai and Sharjah, they were women. So I thought that was an interesting moment to kind of try and explore further. Sorry. I also think it's very, very important just for you to see this list of, these are some of the people who coalesce around the project. And this is how I work. I build a community during the research and the production of the project. That's the first kind of community of both production and reception. So they're, you know, film editors, they're architects, you know, there's my mother and my daughter, you know, everyone who's in some ways had a, well, made a contribution, I feel I need to acknowledge. So, whoopsie. No. Oh, I've done the wrong thing. He told me not to do. Can you? Sorry about that. How do we get back? Okay. Okay. Shall I not touch anything? Okay. Okay, there we go. Stop on the, stop, no. Why is it doing that? Okay, something with the computer. Let's let him sort this out. So this edition, I thought it would be also important to work with different architects. And I really wanted the architects to come from this region. So in my second visit, I started looking for contacts to local architectural practices, but also further beyond Abu Dhabi, in Dubai and Sharjah and Bahrain, and, you know, further sort of in this region. So the way to do it was to write a little kind of competition brief so that people could respond to it. Okay, we've got music, but jazz, technology, you know. It's... Anyway, so I wrote a brief where I just described that I want a temporary pavilion structure which acts as a cinema that is open, it's 20 square meters. And I sent that brief to 10 practices across the region as a competition. So I just sort of called my little competition to find architects. But someone in London suggested to include people who are from the region but also moved to London to study, to live, and so on. But they had a connection to this part of the world. Are we there? Okay, let me get to... Thank you so much. So, oh, this way. Let's get to Abu Dhabi. So we're in Hong Kong. Oops. Okay. So out of this competition, I chose a studio from London. They were at the time calling themselves MMI, which is after their names. So it's Aram Moradian, Georges Massoud, and Summer Islam. I really wanted the cinema to be designed by women, but I never got anything. Well, I didn't have a response from women. So only Summer, who is originally born in Jeddah, but I think brought up partly in Jeddah and partly in London, studied at the Architectural Association. Georges is from Beirut, and Aram has some Armenian roots. So I started, and they responded with this as their project, and I really liked it. And we started working on kind of tweaking it. It had some of the characteristics from the previous edition of you can see people while they're inside the cinema, but it also had some features from the sculpture, kind of turned up by using an industrial material, this chainmail, and making it, slightly more slick. And that's what it looked like. And it always amazes me with architects that, they can make a model and then we get this. It wasn't easy. And Michelle can tell many stories of getting the chainmail from China and, all of those things. But it got done. But of course, the cinema is one part. It's a very important part. But then, where I worked was to think of what would make sense for the film. And just to, you will experience the film if some of you might have already experienced it. My aspiration was to try and find footage. So this is the opening of Abu Dhabi Art. And there were a lot of selfies in front of this structure as well. So it's well distributed in that way. And, these are things you see happen. But the one starting point for the film is, I bring this image because this is a very personal connection. And really the only connection to the Arab world that I had, because my father illustrated Arabian Nights in the 60s. And it was published in London. And he obviously did research to be able to do this. And when I looked at his illustrations, his book, I thought, well, I need to do my own research and I need to tell a different story. And I think the story is really what drives all cultures, whether it's just the oral story, whether it's a visual story. And I then contacted, so I was, beginning to look for film, archival film, related to this region, where narratives are built by different agents. So the films which were readily available to look at is the BP, British Petroleum Archive, which is all online, which is a kind of obvious place, but also, politically interesting place, because this is, the images that they've made of this region are still circulating. as the ones that describe the region. So their narratives are very, very embedded in a kind of, global audience of what is the Emirates. They were here long enough to make a lot of films. And so I thought it's a good place to start. But all of their films are, of course, official. Well, they're propaganda for the BP, for this region, to attract people to come and move here. And also they're made by professional film crews that have nothing to do with the region, British men, you'll see. So what they filmed, and these are some of the stills from these films, had very, very few women. These women are in a kind of, ritual that was and observed by men. So I was struggling how to, and in fact, because I didn't want to make a film related to oil, in those films, that was the predominant narrative. So I actually stripped those films from the narrative of the oil and looked at what was left over and used a lot of that. But that didn't seem to me the right thing to do. So I then set up to try and find private footage that was not officially sanctioned, that was made by people who lived here. And of course, that was a very difficult task. I didn't have enough time. I made many contacts, and many people made promises to me that they know about films, that they can contact their families, that they know archives. And I think Michelle Bambling, who is here with us, have had these struggles herself. So nothing was really coming back, nothing at all. And, that tells you a lot about the culture itself: privacy, secrecy, an enclosure around certain taboo themes. But I guess I struck lucky. I decided to use Instagram as my research tool, and I just entered few terms, and this beautiful post just appeared, and it was by a man who was turning 30, so it was his birthday, and he posted a little film of him going back to when he was a child, which was in the 90s. And he was exactly the age of my daughter, who was also born in 89. So there was this kind of resemblance of, footage of my own child that I did on a camcorder in the 90s. And I decided to contact him. He is not here tonight, although I invited him, and he promised me that he will be here, which is a shame. Something must have came up. And so he's an artist and designer, probably known to some of you, called Ahmed Al-Arif. And he digitized, or he made it possible and he got the permission of his father and uncle, and sent me 8 hours of films that were shot between about 91 and 95. And let me use it, but with one very important caveat, which was that I could not include any female members of the family in my film. So, we agreed. I signed the contract. But I thought that what I discovered through these films, which is probably, for me, the biggest surprise, revelation about the region, is I discovered tenderness between men. And that is so beautifully captured in his in the footage of his father. So this is inside the cinema, the previous edition, which, you know, attracted all kinds of viewers. That's how the film begins. It was also important that the film is narrated by women. Now, that's a second layer. You know, all the footage that I had was, the BP footage has a narrator, which just, you know, tells you a story that they made up. And I invited the women that I met in my research to tell the story from their childhood. So it's kind of, you know, trying to think of how I got to know Arabian Nights, how these stories are pretty much a kind of, if you like, a global, have a global audience because they have been known to many cultures. And then inviting women to hear their voices, and they all speak Arabic. So the film, you know, I sometimes ask myself, how do I, a Polish person who who grew up under communism, ends up making a film in Arabic? You know, it takes I guess some courage, but it's also an enormous risk. It is not a culture that I completely understand, but I also think it's very important to try and make sense of a culture that is not your own, but to which you have some relation. And I think the story, and especially the Arabian Nights, is one of those points, is to kind of unpick that relationship. So I invited the women I met to narrate kind of a story of their choice, and some of them are from Arabian Nights. So Hind, who will be speaking in a minute, who I met in Dubai in April, agreed to read Sinbad, and you know, there is a kind of conjunction between images and the story she reads, which in fact you didn't like in the beginning, but you got to kind of warm up to it. So I use Arabic, and you know, all the women that were invited, as for those of you who are Arabic speakers, will realize that they come from different parts of this part of the world, so they're speaking in different accents, which of course I couldn't tell. So this is a bit from Hind's. And there is, you know, footage also that is in the BP archive, but wasn't shot by them. They just collected everything related to oil. So this is a French crew that made a film of sort of early exploration. And the important part when it comes to video, so this early video, you know, this is video from the 90s, it has a lot of glitches. It has, and I thought it was like very important to foreground the medium itself. It's not the beautiful 35mm film that, you know, the crews, the British BP people used. And also you see the timer running. You also have this kind of access to, it's in that moment, and it's all visible to you through the timer. So this is a beautiful scene. So the family goes on holiday to Pakistan. You know, not something you could imagine now. This is also very, very important, that there were the days when the region was, you know, in a very different state of friendliness or cooperation. So the family goes to Pakistan skiing, and you know, they have snowball fights, and so these men are just fooling around as we would in Poland. I would say snowball fights is something that's very evocative. So here is Ahmed Al Arif as a 3-year-old boy the footage from his uncle. And that's him in '89 with his father, just playing on the floor. So this is this tenderness that I also felt. You know, these are the images that I really want to distribute, because this is something that doesn't enter the official story. And it's also very difficult, not just in this culture, but generally, to talk about tenderness between people, especially between men. You know, it's something we have very, very little access to. So this just shows you the equipment that they used. So it's a big, I guess it's a camcorder, like an early version. This is 91, I think. And this is the equipment that the BP crew would use. So I'm showing you this also because, you know, all of these aspects are so important to how we perceive the representation that was made. And a setting sun. I think I'll stop here and give the floor to Hind, and we'll carry on in a kind of more conversational mode. So thank you.
You need to sit with me, because I think when I ask you questions, okay. Yeah. So we'll sit.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce the two conversationalists. Hind Mezaina is an artist, writer, and programmer, film programmer, whose work delves into themes of collective memory, the notion of heritage, and representations of Dubai and the UAE in media. Her work is a continuous development of what she describes as visual archaeology, through research, observation, collecting, and preserving memories. Working primarily with photography, more recently she's been working in video and collage, and her work has been exhibited in numerous exhibitions in the UAE and abroad. Next to her, Woodman Taylor, who is a professor of art history at Zayed University. He's an art historian, curator, and musician whose scholarship and curatorial practice explicate visual cultures in both West and South Asia. He's also a founding editor of Tribe, Photography and New Media for the Arab World, and currently researching contemporary photography in the UAE. Last fall, he co-curated the acclaimed exhibit, Contemporary Photography from the Arab World, which was held at the American University Museum in Washington, D.C., which included 55 artists, half of whom were women. And his first installation, Cycling the City, was commissioned by Dubai Culture in commissioned by Dubai Culture in 2014 at the Sikka Art Fair. And also I want to mention Hind has a fabulous blog, which if you don't know, The Culturist, is amazing. And that's when I moved here, where I came to find out information. So welcome them, and then we will have them engage in a conversation, and then we will open it up for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dale. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It was great listening to you talk about the work to this extent, because obviously we've had discussions during your visits here. And I think, you know, the early discussions were kind of the frustrations of accessing archive material. I mean, I don't have a presentation, or this is just going to be really conversational. And I think that was it. Like, you know, I think the idea is to show archive material, but whose archive material and who owns it and how is it presented. And my frustrations usually is that it's a very kind of controlled availability of what is called archive or history. It's very kind of almost state sanctioned. It's very much about, you know, the leaders. It's very male centric. There's not much access to seeing women and doing day-to-day jobs, you know, home or children, and it's still an issue. Hence, you can even show a private collection, you know, where the caveat was you can't show my mother, my sister, etc. Even though a lot of us won't recognize them, so it's not like they're all famous people. But there is this culture which I think will take a really, really long time to be comfortable about showing women without it feeling like, you know, it's a private, you know, the foreigners cannot see them kind of attitude, because that's what it is. It's more, you know, besides the male, it's just also like it's private and public, like is a huge topic. So I'm glad it led to found someone who was able to give you something, even though it wasn't everything you wanted to show, and the idea of inviting then women, so still injecting women's presence in the video, and in this case, voice. And I mean, I think with my, like the first, when you told me a fairy tale, the first one I thought of was Sinbad. And to me, Sinbad really was more a visual. It wasn't even a story I read or was read to me. It was more Sinbad, the animation. So it's a Japanese anime with Arabic dubbing. And it was in Fusha, so it's very unusual. So Fusha is like classic Arabic, and that's something I remember watching as a kid. And it's about adventure, and it's about traveling, and maybe that's kind of the little seed that grew in me, because I travel a lot. I love traveling, discovering, and so that's one of my favorite cartoons. I loved watching it as a kid, and that was the first story that came to mind. But then, as I said, it was something I had watched, so I don't have like I don't have a book to read, to narrate, to give Marysia. And I started looking for stories, because obviously with Sinbad there's lots of stories, because different chapters, and different chapters are set in different places, etc. And I started kind of looking for them, and then I really did want it to be read in Fusha. And obviously we don't speak Fusha, and English is kind of what I predominantly speak. I'm Emirati, but mixed. My mother is Egyptian, my father is Emirati. And my day-to-day speaking is Egyptian, so it's like literally the mother tongue, right? So it's like, wait, how do I now position this where I read it in Fusha, which feels alien, because although I read Fusha, but I don't speak Fusha, and they're two completely kind of different things for me in my head. So it took a while, and it's like almost, I wanted to be anonymous at one point, where I said, don't include my name and let it be just kind of float there. And she insisted, no, it should have my name. So it was, but I've obviously completely overcome it, and it's great to be part of this project. But again, I think it goes back to, what the present representation, and how do you represent, but I'm talking, sorry if I'm taking up time, but I think it's also to ask questions to Marysia. I mean, would you do things differently in hindsight? I mean, I know the challenges and the struggles. Is there anything that if you could go back in time, do it differently?
I almost feel like this is an unfinished project. It is very much hindered by conditions under which it was developed, so time. And also, to do anything like this, and again, Michelle, we talked about this earlier today, it takes time to build trust with people, because you're essentially changing the culture. You are making people comfortable with themselves, and that takes time. For someone to say, okay, I will show you how I looked 30 years ago and how my father was fooling around with me. It's a huge decision. And it's a huge decision not just in this culture. It's in any, if anyone approached me and wanted to, show my daughter from that same period, I would probably hesitate as well. So it's a kind of learning process. So it's a learning process for me as an artist, for me as a woman, as a person, entering a culture at the hardest point. I think, that is such an important challenge for every project for me, is that I never make it easy for myself. And I certainly don't make it easy for others too. So I also ask people to work hard to overcome their own preconceptions. So whether I would do it differently, I think I probably would have needed like another year to keep on looking, to keep on talking, to keep on finding, to maybe even create occasions, what we had this morning, which was with wonderful students of Dales, who some of them are here, to hear how they struggle with the same issues. So, it could be a much more, I think, in-depth project, and also culturally relevant if there was more time and kind of more discursive moments, I would say.
And time, I guess, is a big theme here, where a lot of things are always done in a hurry. Projects come to one, very last minute. We're running out of time. We don't have enough time. We need to do it quickly. And that's kind of this constant thing I hear. And everything's always in a rush. And it's always like, to present it. And it needs to be done in a few months, where anywhere else it would take years, and the slowness, because there's a pleasure of research. I mean, part of the whole, the joy of research is the discovery, and to think of what you haven't discovered. And I keep thinking, oh my God, what if, what, like a version of this project is, what it could have been, and what kind of material you could have found. And yeah, I mean, again, I'm just rambling, maybe my kind of, like the issues I deal with, why there's not enough kind of a trust or belief or sharing, and then giving it time to think about it and to think of the importance of sharing maybe personal archives and what it means to show, and versus kind of, because I think when old footage is shown, there's just always immediate, oh, nostalgia, and we miss the old days, but there's no, what I always want is a deeper thinking, and what does the past mean in the context of the present. And I don't want to talk about the future, because everyone's always talking about the future here. Everything's always 5 years away. And, Expo 2020, everyone's been talking about it like from 5 years ago. And it's like, wait, what's happening now? And what does the now, how does it matter? And what happens now, how will it reflect later on? So I even today, so I think of what's being done today and how is that preserved, and how will that be accessed in a few years' time, right? And will it change? Because there are these accounts, and Instagram seems to be an interesting source to find certain things like this, and it'll be watermarked, so you can't even kind of like take it and use it and say it's found footage, and because there seems to be an ownership. I think ownership seems to be important, even if it's old footage from TV shows. There'll always be the watermark of the account holder, so almost kind of creating an ownership over something which is not necessarily created by that person. And it just becomes, you miss the old days, things were nicer then and easier, but there's no deeper discussion about, okay, what is different, and not that the past was, it's very sugar-coated. There were really tough times. No one wants to go back 40 years ago and live that lifestyle, electricity, water, like it was a really, really tough time. But that doesn't get addressed enough. I think a lot of time it's just how quick we've progressed. But and then when the old days are talked about, the simple old days, and lamenting the past, but not really addressing it, I think, with honesty. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to say that this is something which happens in all different cultures, because it's also this tension between tradition, conservation of something. How do you conserve certain values so that they endure? And, coming to terms that the world is maybe not in a good place. And the reason why it's not in a good place is partly to do with all these issues of ownership and property and capital and wealth creation, which excludes so many people who can take part in it. So while I guess in a project like this you're constantly aware of these pressures from traditional aspects of the culture, and also the desire of that same culture to, when you walk into a shopping mall in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, it is sickening. It is like the really, really the other end of things. It's where everything is in a way erased by, Louis Vuitton and Gucci and so on. And it happens on all levels. So, how do you introduce something like this, which is intimate, which is low resolution, which will never look great? How do you introduce it not as a form of failure, but another kind of value that there needs to be space for that.
Woodman, do you want to?
Yeah. Is it on?
No.
It was on.
It was on.
It was on. Oh, it's on now. Okay. No, thank you very much, Marysia. Amazing work. I was really interested in the process. Actually, two different aspects to it. One of the cut and mix that you do in terms of the two different archives, cut them and then put them in juxtaposition to create new meaning. Also to actually erase that male voice, and also to insert a women's voice. And actually, I thought it was amazing, looking just now again, to see that there's sort of ethnographic footage from the oil people, but then when you add poetry from the Arabic sort of thing and some translation, it gives a whole different meaning. But I was wondering also how, and that you don't show women, and so it's a voice, and so you're sort of going against this sort of visuality, which is often very male. I was wondering whether it relates back to your earlier interest in terms of recording women's artists' voices, and maybe related also to your process, which again reminds me a bit of Judy Chicago, and seeing all the women around collaboratively, sort of making sure there's an insertion of women into the history of art.
Yeah. Well, I think just to mention the project, the Women's Audio Archive, it is a very, very important moment in my own history, because I left Poland. So I grew up in Poland under communism, and I was also educated there. And I left in 1985, so that's just the end of martial law, if you know what that was. But and I went to live in London. Now, how do you, I was already a young woman, but how do you insert yourself and your own voice into a culture where you didn't study with anyone? And in England, that is the one place where it kind of sets you for life. It's who you studied with or where you studied. So I arrived, already after I completed my studies, and therefore had really no community into which I could speak. So instead of doing what people suggested I do, which was to go around with my slides to galleries, which I thought how humiliating that would be, I just began carrying a tape recorder and recording conversations that I was having with women in cultural field. But I did it as a sort of, I guess, building my confidence in this new situation, and also to learn what was relevant to them and what I could contribute. So it's a very different way of thinking of yourself as an artist who, I didn't have anything that was ready-made, because I came from such a different set of circumstances in Poland. And I also wasn't one of these artists, and there are many of them who I appreciate a lot, but it was not my way of narrating the misery from which I, let's say, escaped. So I wanted to understand what is the culture in which I am going to contribute. And the recordings really helped me to do it. But they were totally private. And it was 20 years later that I went back to this, mainly because of a very enlightened woman curator called Marysia Lewandowska, who saw all these cassette tapes in my studio, and she just asked me, "What is this?" And I told her, and she said, "Well, make an inventory of what you've got here." And I did, and she said, "You've got amazing material." Because I was meeting people like Nan Goldin and not Judy Chicago, but I did record Judy Chicago in talks. I had not just women, in fact. I had, John Cage and Alan Kaprov and Donald Judd speaking. I was carrying a tape recorder and simply just putting it on wherever, there were people talking. So that material then got digitized, and I started, in 2009, I worked on turning it into a proper online archive. But as all my work is released under Creative Commons, I needed everyone to agree, everyone who I recorded, to agree to release it into the public domain. And that's a whole separate project, time-consuming. By that time, people like Nan Goldin, you can't even talk to her. You have to, talk to her dealer. And also everything is monetized. And I said, no, this is not to be monetized. This is something that needs to be open, that needs to be shared. So I think, I have this streak in me, which probably comes from, having received a very particular education, in a country such as Poland, that you fight, you don't give up. So I guess there is that in every project that I encounter.
I had a question for the two of you, because I know, Hind, you also have used footage of Emirati women dancers and sort of the modern disco sort of thing, as you have also, Marysia, in your work, and whether you mined these sort of historic footage and did different sorts of things with it in terms of your own work, or how it's important for creating your own work in terms of using this sort of footage.
Yeah, I mean, again, it becomes like searching, and YouTube is a great source, but again, a lot of it is a copy of a copy of a copy, so it's not the best qualities, and it's hard to know how to find the source. We don't have a proper kind of archive within the TV broadcasting network, where I mean, I've had easier access in London, where I wanted to look for footage from the disco competition, on Thames TV, and it's listed on the British Film Institute's website, and it's, and I typed it, it turned up, and there was a link, here you want to make an appointment, I go, it was on cassette, I viewed it, and it was a great copy, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start if I want to look at something officially, let alone is it even preserved, right? So all these, because in the early TV days, a lot of what we saw was recorded in Kuwait, because they had a proper kind of TV studio system. And so a lot of people upload lots of things that I watched as a kid. So whether it's songs, and they were recorded for TV studio, so those kind of the music videos of the day. So it's very staged, male singer with the females dancing. And they're not, and I don't know their nationality, but they look like, from the Gulf region, because the way they're dressed. I don't know if they're actually from the Gulf. And then over time, obviously, when we hit the 90s, and then MTV, and then Dubai Media City set up, and the women started looking different. The women dancing in those TV shows where the male singer, they started looking different. They're not dressed like, women of the Gulf, and kind of the jeans got tighter, the hairs got longer, the nails got longer, and the makeup. And it was a face I don't recognize, and I don't wear the abaya or the shayla, but it was still something that it's not, I'm like, wait, this doesn't kind of fit in of here. And I was just basically taking these clips just found online, put them together, and I overlaid it with the Kylie Minogue song. It was shown at the Abu Dhabi Art, because there was a separate exhibition called Dancing Girls, and I think it was a commentary of finding footage of women of here. So like I said, not necessarily, has to be UAE nationals, but a representation of diversity of women, and women, not children, because I think it all started with the hair down. So the ayala, that's kind of what I remember seeing, and then over the decades, when you see the dancing, they just became younger and younger girls, and then suddenly it was treated as that's heritage and that's the folkloric dance. But I'm like, I remember there were young women who were doing this dance, and then it became almost no, it's shame, for young women doing that. Then it's women of ill repute, and so again, this kind of who's dictating this narrative and who's just making these decisions, and it just starts being written and suddenly becomes official. And one of the things I really cannot stand here is fact-checking. Lots of publications, they just publish things. This is the first, or this is what it is, and there's no fact-checking. And it just becomes, unless you point it out. And I think it's this tradition of, history is passed on verbally, memories, and it's still like that, and it's 2019, right? So, again, it's just this for me anyway, I distrust information, because, the source is never reliable. Whoever, like I said, there's just everything's just taken for granted without kind of pausing. And because people come and go over here, short-term memory, and it's just down to people who, have lived here long enough, regardless of nationalities, Emiratis or non-Emiratis, who try to go, no, wait a minute, that's not correct, that's etc. So with that video, I think it was more like searching or trying a commentary on how this hair dancing, which was very normal to see in the 70s, suddenly kind of started changing, and why is it okay to bring women who are and like they're Iraqis or Syrian, and then this was also a commentary on it was the first Gulf War, and suddenly there's an influx of people from that part of the world. And now they've been taken on to do these jobs, which maybe is not respectable for women of the Gulf to do. So it's, like to dance in a music video on TV, So it was kind of positioning those. But it was interesting when people first saw it, and it was just, oh my God, this is so cute. And oh, I remember this video. And it was and yet there was also, wait, why don't I see this anymore? And this has changed. And so it was a very varied response to it. And it's only like when I get into a conversation, then I think I articulate a lot more that I want to show versus maybe than just the video. But I think part of it is also to see how people respond to it. And so that's kind of, and that was one of the first times where I really liked kind of working with found footage. So, and I'm not taking anyone's permission. I'm just like, this is on YouTube. Whoever's posted it, that person doesn't own it either. Do I need to go to Kuwait and knock on their doors and get like a cleaner version? Probably, but I didn't go. And so I think just whatever I find, I like to see what does it mean today? What was okay in the past, and why isn't it okay today? Same with like belly dancing in Egyptian movies. There was like so much of them in the past, and now it's just less and less. I kind of did a little montage. It was shown at Art Dubai, because the wedding project. Yeah. And I associated weddings with belly dancing, like Egyptian weddings, there's always a belly dancer. And again, I was finding footage from I'll take a lot of these films are online, so I'll just take these clips. But again, where it was okay to see belly dancing on TV in the past, in these movies, but not necessarily in kind of contemporary cinema.